Our final session of the conference will be another fireside chat, which will explore how will AI shape the schools of the future. This will be led by Sharifa Hajat, the founder of Arab eLearning Academy. Sharifa will introduce you to our speakers and lead the chat this evening. Looking forward to the last session of the day, and I will now hand it over to Sharifa.
Thank you, Ryan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would like to welcome you, everyone, to this very interesting and up-to-date hot topic in the whole world about artificial intelligence. And talking about artificial intelligence, how it is going to impact education in the coming era. Actually, it started already to be in action in school. We have in the panel today to discuss this topic, Dr. Tassos Anastasiades, Principal of Finnish School of Kosovo, and Dr. Carmel Kent, Head of Educational Data Science, UCL Institute of Education, UK. Welcome, Dr. Tassos and Dr. Carmel. So when we talk about education and AI in education, when we talk about AI in general, we think about robots and having very intelligent conversations with a human being, helping in resolving issues, being a customer service agent. How it is in the school? What does artificial intelligence is bringing to the schools in the coming near future? Dr. Carmen?
Yes, hi. First, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to take part in that forum. Yeah, that's a very, I think, important question and a very good choice to start with, because the AI industry is, as you said, it's all over our daily lives already. But when we are talking about AI in education, there are particular intricacies and particular flavors that we really need to pay attention to. One of them is that AI is following the pedagogy, not the other way around. So we can talk a lot about automating processes. We can talk a lot about taking the load of administrative tasks from teachers, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, every single thing that we are doing, starting from designing and defining which data we need to collect, going on into modeling and to designing the UI of those systems, everything should be led by the pedagogy, the pedagogical aims, how we want to, what kind of learning outcomes we are aiming at, etc., etc. So that's one thing, and one of the derivative of this is that similarly to other areas like healthcare, but maybe not as, maybe less similar to other areas, the data is sensitive. We're talking about young learners, not just young, but also like young learners. We're talking about learning, which is a journey that surrounding us all day long, 24 hours, 7 days a week. We need to be super sensitive about the data that we are collecting and how we are using that. So any kind of guidelines, ethical guidelines that we would be usually taking a lot of precautions in other areas in education, I think it's even much more in the core of everything that we are doing and should be doing with AI. Sharif, I think you're muted.
Yeah, technology. Because you're talking about the pedagogy, and this is something that in every single technology that we see new in the education, we usually see the technology comes in first, and then people start thinking about using it in the proper way. So sometimes this will make the technology a little bit limited in the impact that we're hoping for. We will come to this point when we talk about the changes in artificial intelligence, but I thought that this is a pattern that we see when every single technology, new technology is introduced, usually in the education, because the what we're measuring for the student learning is different than the banking sector. Banking sectors, for example, are more direct and more straightforward in terms of what are we measuring as an impact in these industries, unlike education. So we'll come to that definitely in, when we progress in the discussion. So I'm going to ask Dr. Tassos now about, because we're talking about now the changes in the classroom and the changes in the teaching. How do you see this happening and impacted by artificial intelligence? What are the changes coming to teachers, to schools, to the teaching environment, or even on the biggest scale of ministries of education? Talk to us about that.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you. Honestly, technology has been here for a long time, but now post-COVID, many of us have been forced to use it much more productively. And looking at learning is, as Dr. Carmel pointed out, is what is critical. And what I'm finding is learning is now more accessible to everyone. It's becoming much easier to share objectives. For example, we here in Kosovo run a global school as well, so we have students in their classrooms from different parts of the world. When I'm teaching biology, I'm also teaching some students actually from Dubai, from Albania, some from US in the same lesson. We're able to share the learning objectives much easier. And what I'm finding is the youngsters now are much more, much quicker at retrieving information. It's not so much content-based. We're able to think critically. They're able to think critically. We're becoming much more facilitators, inspiring learning, questioning learning, rather than passing on information, because information is very easily available. And not only that, we've now got an enormous bank of data. For example, we use benchmark data from dual assessment. We've got cognitive ability tests. We've got progress tests that can create a very clear picture of a student before we even see the student. The response time is very, very quick. I can teach a class of 30 now without having to worry about any kind of discipline problems. You know, all they need is our iPads. They're all focused. We use Microsoft Teams. We share the objectives and we initiate class discussion, content retrieval. And not only that, we have evidence of learning. The assignments, the evidence is there. So every 6 weeks, we can review the learning, and we've actually got evidence of that learning on tap. So it's actually a quite interesting time for us as educators and teachers. We no longer have 5 or 6 students in the classroom. We can now teach globally, and we can teach very large classes and give them the same quality of learning environment.
Certainly opening so much horizon in terms of the learning and learning from anywhere and learning at any time. But from your perception, do you see then artificial intelligence works better in a hybrid environment, hybrid arrange environment, yes, or as adaptive learning where a student learn on their own? How do you see the value of each one of them?
The hybrid environment I find is much more productive because we use Microsoft Teams chat, and I'm sure there are lots of other similar kind of things. So we initiate. So for example, if I share a learning objective like the mitochondrion, students have got, and then I ask questions. And then students are given opinions, and then they're challenging each other's opinions wherever they are, and they're posting ideas. They're posting representations, they're creating according to their own learning style. They can type, they can speak, they can create a picture. In other words, it benefits all learning styles. So this hybrid model where I've got the students in front of me as well, so we've still got the eye-to-eye contact and we can talk to each other, but they can quickly type and discuss. You know, the others from anywhere in the world can have the same experience because they're also seeing the students. They're also engaging in the discussions. It's just wonderful. It just works so smoothly. And of course, as I said, you you can challenge the evidence that they're producing. Or, you know, I know it's open to abuse and they do cut and paste and copy from the internet, but then you can just ask a question, just explain what you mean by that, and immediately you challenge their thinking. I mean, we all use Google and the internet to retrieve information. It's how we use it. So we as a teacher says, well, why? What is this? And the discussion is more about why think deeper, apply, than I'm just telling you about this. So yeah, it's really a different way of teaching. It's actually challenging and using skills-based learning rather than just us teachers passing on content to the students, which is pretty boring.
And how did you see the AI, for example, helping you in that regard in understanding interactions of students on different levels or from different backgrounds, how they fulfill the objectives and the learning outcomes then?
But the beauty of it, you see, is if we share the objectives, and it can be a challenging objective or a basic objective. And I always do. I always identify objectives as either basic expectations from your curriculum. We use Cambridge AS, for example, so it actually does that for us. It talks about a basic information, applied information, or more challenging information. But what I'm finding is the students, even on the basic information, are challenging. Because they've got the support mechanism to actually be able to use knowledge at a much higher level than if I was just telling them. So I'm finding even the EAL, the students that are not very good. I've got students who speak very little English, but of course, because they're able to translate the objective and use a variety of sources to come up with their learning evidence. It takes away the language barrier in many ways as well, because it gives them time to translate in their own way and to think about it and to use knowledge from their own language. So it takes a lot of the barriers away. Even learning difficulties, students are now very, very articulate in using technology. So it's something that they were born with. You know, that generation was born with mobile phones and iPads, you know. They don't know anything different. So they're very, very quick at it, incredibly quick. So I'm finding I'm being able to cover a lot more and get more evidence of learning than I used to before. It's now about, you know, encouraging them to think much deeper. And it's so much easier for them to think deeper with this artificial intelligence and provision. And it's very inspiring for them. It's very inspiring for them. You know, they produce YouTubes, for example, now. We didn't have that before. So one of my students produced a YouTube on a nucleus, and it was amazing. I could never have done that, and that was prepared in perhaps half an hour. So we really are untapping all their talents.
This is really fascinating, and I hope also during the discussions we can have more example from you in your program and what the students are producing as outputs to that. But it comes directly to my mind that we also need to be prepared. For example, when you talk about the students and using MS Teams and using the different technologies, schools have to be prepared to use these technologies. Teachers have to be prepared. Students have to be prepared, and organizations on the level of ministries of education, for example. Dr. Carmel mentioned once during our discussions on the chat that you have an AI readiness program. Would you tell us a little bit about what are you doing in this AI readiness program? How do you ensure that the organization on the different levels and the stakeholders of different levels are ready for this new technology and taking an active part in it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So we are a research-based small company spun out of UCL. We are based on the concept of a triangle. We call that the golden triangle, bringing together research, educators, and edtech companies. So the whole idea is about how to help edtech companies and educators actually use research to really understand not just how efficient the educational technology is and what kind of questions can I ask technology providers about which data they're collecting about us, et cetera. But also exactly the point that Tassos just mentioned, which you called learning evidence. It's all about when most people are, as you mentioned, when you just introduced the session, Sharifa, when you're mentioning AI, most people will think about robots. But actually, AI is a lot about the process. So these very complex concepts that we use in learning, like concept that you already mentioned, like engagement, interaction, interactivity is such a central concept now, especially when we have the whole COVID reality and people are going in and out of schools. We need to maintain that level of interactivity between learners and content, between the learner and the instructors, et cetera. How do we measure that? Do we even know what interactivity is? So we want to understand those very complex construct like interactivity, like engagement, like what is learning evidence? So for you, Tassos, learning evidence might be one thing. For another teacher, it might be completely a different thing. What are the objectives that we want to achieve, and how do we measure that? What kind of data we can collect? So what we are doing, we have a program, as you mentioned, called the AI Readiness Program, where we are working with edtech companies and schools to bring them to the point that they are AI ready. It's a fascinating process because through this process, they get to understand themselves much better. They get to understand what data do they have, what data they can actually leverage in order to make their life easier. And especially when they're looking at their own challenges, they have the opportunity to look and understand, is that a challenge worth to solve by AI? Not all the time, no. I mean, many times we would say, no, we need human, we need, it's a very human central process. Many times we will say, well, AI could come and help us in this specific point, like for example, collecting multimodal data to actually understand the learners better. And many of the times we would say no, and at this challenge, we actually identify human capabilities as much better or, you know, much more better regulated than the AI. So it's about taking them through this journey from the point where they know that they have a lot of data. They sometimes know what kind of data they have, sometimes not very much. Sometimes they think they know what are their challenges, and to the point where they are very critical about how they want to use AI, how they don't want to use AI, what kind of measures they need to put as, you know, limitations and restrictions to make it very ethical and very safeguarding, and how to actually design those systems so they will actually answer the needs that they have and not just, you know, be a fun bot, some very cool bot that we just want to show that we have. So, and the AI readiness is one process for us. It's actually start with an earlier process where they become evidence aware. So they understand what kind of evidence they need to collect to show that their pedagogy is working, their edtech is working, it's efficient for which kind of students, how, and after them being evidence aware, they apply the evidence, and just then they go and think about AI and start embark on this fascinating journey. So just to say, to summarize that, I think for me, it's a lot about the process, because when we are working with companies to become AI ready, they get to understand what the business that they are in, learning, education, schools, much better because of AI, thanks to AI, thanks to data, thanks to being more data informed and data driven.
This is very interesting what you're saying, and very fascinating as well, because this is a new mindset when we talk about collecting data to make us understand the interaction the learning interactions and understand the learning behaviors and make decisions based on that. And because it is new concept, how do you find that when you work with the educational sector, for example, how they are receiving that? Is there any type of resistance, or it is received well? Or because once you tell someone that I'm going to collect data to understand if this content is good or not, that might be a little bit threatening in a way. But it is really, we're collecting data not because for judging the personal quality of a particular teacher or a particular content provider or whatever, but we're talking about collecting data as part of the process, what we're saying, because this data makes us understand how we're dealing with what we're dealing with actually. So what, from your experience, how did you see this new mindset received in the education from both teachers, students, schools? If we talk about something like the curriculum, for example, or how do you recognize the good curriculum? How do you build your matrices of the curriculum and the assessment, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's specifically a good question because the atmosphere in which the AI technology now lives in is a very, at times not as positive as it should be. And that's because of misuse of data and misuse of AI in many educational applications. Now, I don't know if you follow what has been going in the UK in the last 2 months. We had a huge fiasco ran by the government of predicting A-level scores at the end of schools. And that's just one example of how policymakers, not just policymakers, but that specific example, misuse AI. And that brings us to a place where, as exactly as you said, a lot of schools would be kind of reluctant because they would, and rightfully so, be concerned about what kind of data you are collecting, what would you know about me, how would you use the data that you are collecting about our students, etc., etc. So what we are doing is, so when we think about AI in education, we think about how AI can obviously help schools and companies, but also we think about how we are helping those educational stakeholders to become more knowledgeable and more informed and more critical about AI. At the end of the day, it's about giving them the tools to do that themselves and to look at the data and to ask very, very difficult questions and to have a very difficult debate about data that is being collected about them and how it is being used. Just as an example, in machine learning, when you are developing prediction models, it's a very low-hanging fruit in many educational contexts, but it's a very risky one. Predicting anything about how students will do in the future, it's a very, very tricky thing to do. Sometimes you must decide not to do it, even though it can give you more information. So what we are doing in this process is that we are making sure that everything that we do collaboratively with the stakeholder, with the company or the school that we are working with. They are actually designing what they need. They are actually designing what they want to collect. Many of the times we actually see them start collecting new data that they didn't think about collecting right now, or they did think but didn't collect very systematically. So it's just about doing it right, we have a very strict ethical framework of doing things, and we bring it up in front, and we are doing auditing of all the processes, ethical auditing, and we actually educate the companies and the schools that we work with, so that they would be able to take that on and do that themselves. So once they know, I mean, all educators know that knowledge is power. So once they know what it is, what are the risks that are associated, and where are the, you know, the bottlenecks and the weaknesses, they are much better positioned than us to actually look and decide what they want to do with it and how they want to use it.
So this is a question now for both of you, Dr. Tassos and Dr. Carmel, because I want to, you're coming now from two different, it is the same, we're in industry of education, but I can also hear in your experiences two different perception. One is coming from working with the industry, and one is coming working from the schools. So I want to understand from Dr. Tassos and then Dr. Carmel, what the flows then you see in AI? What are the pros and cons? What are the advantages and disadvantages from this perspective of each one of you? Dr. Tassos, you're muted, I believe.
Right, sorry. If we're talking about flaws, I like to look at the advantages first, because it's got to be simple. It's got to be able to be used by anybody, and it's got to be learner friendly. And what we're finding is all we need now is an iPad or a smartphone to be able to teach a global curriculum. And in terms of tracking data, we're able now to teach the students to self-assess their own expectations, so they're becoming much more independent learners. So if I'm giving them a learning objective directly from the curriculum, some clarification, they're able to assess themselves, but it's also available, their learning evidence is also available for others to assess. So what I'm doing is, rather than me creating quizzes or giving them tests, they create their own questions and model answers, and they test each other. So the learning process is much more thorough than a teacher just standing up and passing on handouts. The artificial intelligence for learning does not need to be complicated. You know, we can do all of this. We can collect evidence of learning on a Microsoft Teams chat. And that evidence of learning, should you need a prediction for an examination result, it's all there. All right, so you can make, I get my students to analyze their own learning against objectives by using green, amber, and red. So if they haven't understood an objective, it's a simple chart. Every 6 weeks we have, you know, and they're very good. You would think that they put all green. Now, if they put green, I would then say, another student challenge them to make sure it is green, you know, and if they're not able to explain, all this can happen online, right? It can happen with 20, 30 students listening or typing in. It's simple. So the benefit is it's accessible to all, and we don't lose the personal touch at all, because we're actually much closer with the technology now. We're much closer to the students. You're seeing them like we're seeing you, face to face. In fact, you've got much closer one-to-one contact, because you're looking at them in their eyes one-to-one, right? Whereas in classes, you can be disrupted, you can talk about behavior, and of course they're focusing, they're all doing something, they're all kinesthetic. I mean, they're all the benefits of it. I suppose in terms of flaws, it's the flaws that we all know about. We're depending on bandwidth and connectivity and quality, but I think globally now it's becoming so easy to get good bandwidth and good connectivity that it's becoming much less of a barrier. So I don't actually honestly see many flaws at all. I see many opportunities. I see global schooling now being opened up. I see us being able to offer schooling across continents, across time zones, which we're already sampling. And that's very exciting. You can have recorded lessons as well. Very exciting. So yeah, I'm actually very positive about it. I don't see many flaws at all.
And I have another question, just a follow-up question for you, Dr. Tassos, on this, because what you've mentioned about the students' interactions, it's in a mature way. And what are the range of the age range of the student in your school?
Well, we're using it from primary grade 2 all the way up to 18
Right.
years
So,
old.
so
And you
K
know,
to 12, basically.
in terms of
And
writing skills, especially for literacy, you're very, very quickly being able to encourage children to write and explain, right? Which, you still use paper, but they're so much quicker now writing messages. Even grade 2, grade 1, you're beginning to see discussion and writing very, very rapid, which you wouldn't perhaps see as rapid on a paper. You're beginning to see talking at a much more rapid pace because they've got an audience, right? So they're being listened to, and they've been evaluated online by all their other students. So I'm finding that the rate of learning is much more rapid.
very encouraging, actually, because usually the students, or when we started working probably 10 years ago with the virtual classrooms, one of the challenges for teacher was the virtual classroom management, because you don't have the student in front of you. So the distraction is basically much more available. They can be distracted easily. But from what you're saying, the experience you're talking about, the students are much more adapted to the virtual classroom and engaged in it. So do you see this part of the class planning, the virtual classroom planning, the teacher role? Has it changed
Completely.
in a way? Yeah.
And
So
the
what's the
reason it's
teacher role
changed,
now?
the reason it's changed is because lesson planning is not as critical anymore. You're sharing objectives with the students, and you're seeing where they go. So you're not just passing on content. So, for example, whether I'm teaching a grade 7 or a grade 9 or grade 12, my role is different. It's actually asking questions about the objectives that you want them to attain and asking them to provide evidence of their learning. So immediately they're engaged because they love researching, and as soon as you've got them researching and you've got them engaged and asking questions, you've got them captured. So you have this amazing silence, and then suddenly messages are coming up or voices are coming up because they're trying to find out, they're trying to think, and then you then chuck in other questions. Your role is, challenging their learning. It's no longer instruction, right? So I would not call it instruction. You're sharing the learning objectives, what you're hoping that they will learn, and you're just throwing the bait out and say, right, learn in any way that you can and provide me evidence that you can learn this objective. And then you're quizzing it and you're getting them to quiz each other on how they learn. It's actually becoming a very exciting learning environment. Classroom control, well, obviously, once you've got them engaged in the learning process, behavior is not a problem. The main thing is to get them interested in the learning objective and make sure it's age appropriate and accessible to them, and it's interesting to them. So you can experiment in many different ways. Also, their opportunity to present themselves, unbelievable. I mean, to ask them to research and present for 5 minutes or prepare a presentation the next day is endless. So you're passing on the learning to them. No, it is very exciting.
Come to the assessment now, to how are you going to measure now their learning. But after I hear from Dr. Carmel, what's her take on the pros and cons of AI in education?
It's actually so enjoying to hear you, Tassos, and hear about your approach to self-regulated learning, and I think that's amazing. And actually, AI has a great role in self-regulated learning, I think. So when it's important to contextualize when we say AI, what we mean by AI. So essentially, we can say very roughly that AI methods are coming from two main disciplines. One of them is what we call good old AI, which is more rule-based systems. The other one is machine learning, which is much more prevalent today. And I think saying that actually result in a lot of flaws, because I mean, what is machine learning? Machine learning is actually a method in which you are reliant on historical data in order to provide any kind of insight about what is happening, what will happen, what has happened, etc., etc., etc. So that's already a big red flag, and you need to be very, very cautious about that. Again, going back to my example on the A-level fiasco that we had here in the UK, machine learning models are most often not able to suggest any causal conclusions. So for example, if a model can find out that your socioeconomic background relates to how you are predicted, what the grades that you are predicted to have, that's a correlation. It's not a causal relationship. It doesn't mean that if you come from a better or worse socioeconomical background, you will do better or worse in your grades. So it shouldn't be used that way. That is a misuse, and we see example of misuse of machine learning in many places. One of the flaws or the risks are, for example, in discrimination and bias. So since you are learning from a history, the history of the school, the history of the country, or history of learning records of any company, if there was any kind of bias that was caused by humans, sometimes, you know, we also have we also have a pile of cognitive biases of ourselves when we are selecting people, when we are assessing students. We are subjected to a lot of cognitive biases as well. But then when you take machine learning algorithm to learn about the decisions that have been made in the past, and you're developing a model based on that, you're actually subjecting those biases to perpetuate to the future. So that's a huge risk. You need to be very, very conscious and about bias and discrimination. But I think maybe one of the biggest concerns is about autonomy, and I'm talking about decision-making, decision support systems using AI. It's very, very easy to to design systems that will make the decisions for you. That is counterproductive to teaching and to learning, and it's a risk that the autonomy of exactly what Tassos was telling us about, the autonomy of learners to self-regulate themselves and to orchestrate their own learning, and the autonomy of the teachers to use whatever approaches that those autonomies would not be jeopardized by any kind of algorithm.
Fascinating. It's the whole data science and the whole understanding of this data and the interpretation of the data and the decision making, either by the human intervention or the machine intervention. It's totally fascinating subject. But this will, I've been told that we have only 5 minutes, unfortunately. But this will bring us to the last question. So in 50 years from now, Dr. Carmel and Dr. Tassos, 50 years and 100 years from now, how do you see then education? What is happening in education?
Well, I think it's already completely different already. And education is perhaps going to become more internet-based, technology-based, because I mean, I'm going to show you this. This is, I don't know if you can see it. This is just a discussion from our last lesson, and you can see the postings, and you can also see the self-assessments that are being done by the students, and then you can, you know, they're grading each other. I mean, this is just done with a mobile phone. This is what real education is becoming. They're posting, they're discussing, they're articulating online. Now, isn't that what students do all day with their Facebook and their TikToks and their Instagrams? Isn't that what life really is? And all we're doing now is we're allowing them to use what they're very good at, you know, conversations, right? constant conversations, high-level conversations, high-level thinking, high-level postings, and this is just minutes of learning. Now, how long would it have taken me to have drawn one of these diagrams, or ask them to draw one of these diagrams? They're now able to access it, break it down, suggest within minutes. The learning is just incredibly dynamic. So education in 50 years' time is going to be global. There's no doubt about it. We're going to be having classrooms that are from all over the world. We're going to be able to teach from where you are in China, in Saudi, in India, and we're going to be able to have very much global classrooms where everyone facing the same objectives. And not only that, it's going to be assessment for learning, not of learning. Why are we still very archaic in wanting examinations and tests when the children are so good at providing evidence? We're not going to be testing recall anymore. We're just going to be testing creativity, collaboration, the 4 C's, how to convince people, how to put your argument forward. That's the new education. That's the kind of learning we want.
And that's the kind of higher thinking skills that we want our generations to acquire. Dr. Carmel, what do you think of education? What is going to happen in the coming 50 or 100 years from now?
Yeah. I mean, a simple answer would be I don't have a clue. Maybe easier to talk about 5 or 10 years from now, but I totally second Tasso's point about assessment. If assessment will not radically change, it would be very, very hard to support global education, to support mobilization. My vision is that, first and foremost is that we would have a much more inclusive educational system, that everyone will get their opportunity to do whatever they're interested about. But of course, we must break, or we must challenge the assessment method and kind of find how to make learning more serendipitous, how to talk about, and a lot of companies and bodies already are doing it. How they're talking about credentials, they're talking about real-time assessment, formative assessment, they're talking about peer reviews. It's already there. We just need to challenge the system, the assessment of the systems assessment. But much more modular, much more personalized, and of course, much more data informed. That would be my closing fantasy, I think.
I really, it's unfortunate that we will not be able to continue in terms of even the very interesting part of the assessment. That's an important topic for educators, but I have to hand over to Rian. Over to you, and thank you for Dr. Tassos, Dr. Carmel, for your contribution. It has been a great trade of thoughts already, and I wish, inshallah, to continue this discussion over the chat sometime later. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Sharifa, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharifa and Dr. Carmel and Dr. Tassos, for that very interesting panel and for your time this afternoon. That brings us to the end of the EduTech Digital Summit 2020. Thank you again to all of our presenters, moderators, panelists for sharing such rich content throughout the 2-day summit. Thank you to our co-hosts, G20 and the Ministry of Education in Saudi Arabia. And a massive thank you to all of our audience members for tuning in. We look forward to welcoming you again in the near future. For now, have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.